Welcome to our program, Afrocentricity. I'm your host, Michael Washington. We have a very, very special program and a very honored guest here today, Dr. Toyin Falola, a native Nigerian professor at the University of Texas in Austin, who will be talking to us today about the African diaspora and the power of culture. Dr. Falola, how are you doing today? Wonderful.
Good, thank you.
Our topic is the power of culture.
Yes.
The African diaspora.
Yes, please.
Before we get into that topic, could you give us just a little bit of background about yourself? You're from Nigeria.
I'm Yoruba.
Yoruba?
From southwestern Nigeria, and I moved to the United States 10 years ago to teach at the University of Texas at Austin.
And you, how did you get that position? Did they contact you there in Nigeria, or how did they?
No, I was teaching at York University in Canada, and they wanted a senior person to develop the African program there.
So you developed the African program at the University of Texas?
Well, at the graduate level especially.
Okay. Yeah. Now you have an endowed professorship there.
Yes, please.
And its name is?
The Francis Higginbotham Noel Centennial Professor of History.
And what does that mean to be an endowed professor? What does that mean?
Well, it means that in addition to your regular pay, you have private funding to cover your research.
So you have private funding to cover your research?
Yes.
That must mean you're a good researcher.
I think so.
Now you have some 36 to 40 books that you've written, books and articles, and all these books and articles are about African?
Yes, mainly about Africa, West Africa, the Yoruba, and Nigeria. Over a 200-year period, the 19th and 20th centuries. My last book, published by the University of Rochester Press, it's on African intellectuals and nationalism.
African intellectuals?
And nationalism.
And is that out now?
It's out.
And you're working on another project by Greenwood Press now,
on key events in African history.
40 events?
Yes, 40 events.
In African history?
Yes, please.
How soon will that be out?
Next year.
Next year?
Early in January next year.
So no wonder they're paying you so much to do all this research.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move to our topic now. Because part of the publicity says that you are one of the world-renowned scholars in the area of both Africa and the African diaspora. Well, tell us what's meant by this African diaspora. What's meant by that?
Well, it means a number of things. First, it's a historical process, how over 30 million Africans were taken out of Africa between the 15th and the 19th century.
Is it 30 million?
Over 13 million.
Over 30 million.
To the Americas. Of course, they went elsewhere, to Canada, to Europe. So the concept of the diaspora refers to that forced migrations of blacks to Asia, to Europe, to Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, the United States, to Canada. But it means more than that, because it also means a phenomenon of consciousness, how blacks, irrespective of where they are, tend to think that they have a homeland. So there's a diasporic consciousness, and there's a consciousness of a pilgrimage. For instance, if an African American goes to the Gambia, or a Jamaican goes to Ethiopia, there's that concept of the pilgrimage, which we also define as diaspora.
Now you say there's a consciousness,
yes,
suggesting that with people of African descent, there is something in their brain, in their subconscious or conscious mind, that in some way connects them to Africa.
Yes, in various ways. In developing a consciousness of imagination, that they have a home, and this is true, that Africa is their home. A consciousness of historical experience of slavery, of economic exploitation, political marginalization. And they also have a consciousness of imagination. How was it in the past? How could it have been if the slave trade did not take place?
But no, correct me if I'm wrong now. When I grew up in the United States, and myself personally, and a lot of people that I know, the imagery that we had of Africa was imagery of people running around half naked, bones in their nose, throwing spears, the Tarzan images and all that stuff. And many people would say, well, I don't want to be African. I don't want to be connected with Africa. And it wouldn't be until the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement that people said, okay, I want to wear an afro and this sort of thing. So if there's a consciousness there, why would people want to reject wanting to be African?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. The concept of primitive Africa, which is perpetuated by the media so that they can create a distance from the homeland. But by and large, many people also reject that notion because they see culture that is impressive to them. And for those who have traveled to places, they also see that there's that jungle and the tiger is not there.
Most people don't travel to Africa. Most whites, most African Americans, as you point out, if you go to Africa, which I've been to both North and South, Southern Africa, and it's a big difference. You see people driving in automobiles, you see skyscrapers and all that, but most people who never go to Africa remain with that imagery. I have students, for instance, who come from Africa, and they tell me all the time that white and black students ask them, how is life there? I didn't know you guys had airplanes. I didn't know you had cities, because the imagery is still there.
Well, that's the power of the media, how the media feeds the public about things that they think will sell their newspapers, and how the media uses stereotypes to keep retaining the power of imperialism.
Okay. So you're saying we're talking about two different kinds of power here: the power of culture
and the power of control,
and the power of control.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about this concept of power. Your presentation at Northern Kentucky University is called "The African Diaspora and the Power of Culture." And what we're saying now is that there is a power, an external power of control, imperialism, this whole ideal of hegemony or hegemony, of dominance. And you're saying that there is another power called culture.
Yes, which fights to counter that. How Africans have been able to fall on culture to deal with some of those negative stereotypes, to deal with imperialism. So what they do is to fall back on their traditions, their songs, their food, their attire, their worldview, their religion, and to invest all those manifestations of culture with power. So you find a linkage between culture and resistance, as in the Rastafarian movement, culture and religious identity, as in Pentecostal churches.
Pentecostal churches?
Yes.
Oh.
Pentecostal churches that tend to borrow the mode of worship in African indigenous religion, make religion very intense, pray as the African ancestors pray, although they make use of the Bible, but sometimes they read the Bible differently. And they had African songs to church worship, and they build kinship within the church organization.
So what you're saying is sometimes whether African people, African Americans in this case, are conscious of the phenomenon or not, the fact that they would go to church and worship in the way that African people worship.
Yes, because it's very intense. The intensity of worship, the intensity of engagement, and the use of the church to build social networks, and also the use of the church to build political networks. A tradition that you see with Jesse Jackson, with Martin Luther King, how the church has enabled them to advance a number of political agenda.
Okay, because I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing you say one thing, that there are people who are in church, in the African American or black church, who are conscious. Jesse Jackson, Martin Luther King, and perhaps even Farrakhan with the Islamic tradition. But then there might be people who might not be conscious of the Africanness in them, but they're acting it out as a way of expression, and that might in some ways be resisting the oppression.
And sometimes part of what we do and we do very well or we enjoy doing, we may not know the origins of it. For instance, you eat the gumbo, it's an African connection there. Your cloth is an African connection there. Dialects in the South is an African connection. The use of kinship charms in southern U.S. is an African connection. Jazz, blues, the banjo, so that even when people use this, sometimes they do not know the origins of them, or the use of songs. If you are a Protestant in Africa many years ago, or a Catholic, maybe they will ask you to use Latin. You don't stand up and drum. But the use of the drum in some of these churches, even when people do not know the origins of this practice, they enjoy the drum. But there's an African connection to it.
So, in a sense, what you're saying is when African people in the diaspora, people out of Africa, act in their natural cultural selves, that's resistance in a sense.
Yes, it is. But it's also an identity.
It's an identity.
In which they also define themselves by borrowing from ancient practices, old behaviors, and sometimes when they use the metaphor of kinship, the metaphor of a community, they are reconnecting back to history, some of which they know, some of which they have forgotten.
So even, because I know people who are now kind of conservative African Americans who would say that I didn't leave anything in Africa. You know, that I'm not African. I'm a Black American. So even those people, when they're doing these things,
yes, or their physical presence or their physical appearance
is African.
If they have no Africans, where do they get the color from?
Well, that's a very good point. But you see, they perhaps might even call themselves African American.
Yes, which is right.
But they would say, I don't speak any African language, or I don't.
There are Africans who don't speak African language.
That's absolutely. But you also mentioned, you said, I think you said Ebonics. Did you mention that, or did you mention talk? What's meant by this, Ebonics?
Ebonics is Creole language, which is not specific to the U.S. or in all situations where two cultures and two languages have interacted. There's a tendency to borrow words, to borrow grammar and syntax. For instance, in West Africa, along the coast, there's a pidgin language.
Pidgin means?
The blending of vernacular languages with English or with French. And you find Creole in Louisiana. So Ebonics is the creolization of language in which they are taking structure from an African language or an African community dialect and adding that to English in a very creative process.
Okay, so basically what you're saying about Ebonics is that African people, wherever they are in the diaspora, whether they're in Europe, whether in Asia, South America, North America, that when they talk, they're basically using African structure. But whatever the European country is that they're using the medium to express themselves in, that's Ebonics, because they're using African structure to communicate with the foreign, let's say, language, the European language system. For instance, we might say, tell me if I'm wrong on this, is that in Africa, Africans often use double negatives.
Yes.
And if you hear people of African descent talk anywhere in the world, you might hear, I didn't do that, or I didn't do that, because the D replaces the TH sound, which Africans don't have that TH sound.
Or sometimes they use the language of plural. Instead of saying E, they use they. Which is a plural way of showing respect to people who are older than you. If you're Yoruba, for instance, sometimes you don't use E for your father, you use they to mean that it's bigger than one person, or it's not the equivalent of yourself. And E maybe suggests something rude, but they suggest something bigger and more and plural.
So when they adapt to the languages, they carry that with them, that concept of they versus just a singular kind of an idea. So even when we talk, without even knowing it, we
internalize some of these.
The Africanness, and that's identity and resistance. Now, when you say identity, I think people have an idea of what that means. That means we're trying to find out who we are, and we're trying to establish ourselves, whether it's in the context of church or religion, let's say, or say the context of our profession, let's say. But when you talk about resistance, resistance against what? And what's meant by this resistance?
Well, depending on the situation, sometimes it can be resistance against injustice. Sometimes it can be resistance against what you think is evil. But mainly it's resistance against political domination, economic exploitation, and cultural imperialism. Because people want to be able to affirm themselves. People want to empower themselves. People want dignified lifestyles, and people want occupations that will make them happy. And whenever they think that those are not possible, and they identify groups that they think do not make that possible, they tend to resist. And in trying to resist, part of what they do is to fall on their culture. For instance, the resistance against slavery in Cuba, people use ethnic associations, or sometimes they use secret societies, which is an idea that came from West Africa, how you can use a secret society to organize a resistance. Or sometimes they will fall on music, or sometimes they will fall on stories. So the point is there are many examples in which they return back to culture or to traditions to see those aspects that can bring them together, prevent one member from betraying the other people, inspire those who are committed to an idea, and also mobilize to fight when it's necessary to do so.
You used the concept of music, and before, I think I interrupted you when you were talking about, for instance, Bob Marley and whole reggae music. Could you talk a little bit more about Bob? Because a lot of people just think Bob Marley. They go to the bar, they drink beer, they listen to Bob Marley. They don't know that's a part of a movement of resistance, a part of a movement of identity, the Rastafarian concept. Could you talk a little bit more about that and give us some more examples of music?
Yeah, it's a political idea and a religious idea. What people see about Bob Marley is the dreadlock, the dread language, which is a sort of ebonics, and sometimes they smoke. But they do not see various...
Smoke?
Yeah.
What kind of smoke?
They smoke ganja. But sometimes people do not see various aspects. The one, they promote a culture of vegetarianism. They promote a culture of good eating habits. They read literature generated by Marcus Garvey, Al-Salasi, Frantz Fanon. And they tell members to be devoted to religious worship, especially they believe in an older form of Christianity with a linkage to Ethiopia, where they see a former king of Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie, as a god, as a representative of God, and God is regarded as being black, the construction of the black god. And that is that's an aspect of the use of culture for emancipation, for resistance, and also for identity.
So in a sense, what you're saying is people like Bob Marley, for instance, who would take music as a medium, internationalize it, is in a sense countering the whole ideal of imperialism, because oftentimes, as you know, like Tarzan, Edgar Rice Burroughs would create this image of Tarzan to internationalize the idea that Africans are savage or inferior kinds of beings. But Bob Marley was saying the same thing. He's saying we're going to take this cultural movement and we're going to mainstream it. We know what it means, and those who follow our ideas know what it means. And hopefully we can gather support from the mainstream, even though most of them may never know what the language is that we're talking, what we're doing. But we're going to use this as a medium by which to make our movement well known and broad, and even enhance our strength, our cultural strength.
And it works.
You think it works?
It works because we were able to not only create a youth culture Bob Marley and others have been able to draw from music political power. In other words, they've successfully invested reggae with political power. And members of the Rastafarian movement also see in reggae an opportunity to meditate, in which they're not just singing, but they're also reflecting on spiritual forces. And many of the songs are actually of a spiritual nature. If you are not a member of the movement, you can enjoy it, but as far as they are concerned, it's an agency of meditation.
Isn't there kind of, in a sense, a fear, in a sense, that that movement can be co-opted? I mean, isn't there a threat that if I take my stuff and put it in the mainstream, that the dominant media can co-opt my movement and dilute the strength of my message and turn it into something that I didn't intend for it to be?
Well, that possibility is there, as you can tell, say with hip hop, in which some big recording companies can take over, or as you can see with a number of African music as well. But bear in mind that it doesn't necessarily mean that the attempt to dominate them is successful. Reggae is a good example. The Rastafarians have been able to resist, say, the domination of reggae music. In other words, although Bob Marley can be selling in millions of copies, but his ideas to the Rastafarians have not been destroyed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now you mentioned hip hop. Would that be another example of music using African medium to make a message? And if so, how would that work? Because if we talk about rap music, there are different kinds of rap music, all the way from the vulgar to the real clean up kind of rap music. And does that relate to your?
Well, music manifests itself in the ways you've described it, in which you have serious person, political people, those who do love. But those who study music have seen African connections in so many aspects of American music, especially in blues and jazz and hip hop, the way people dance. Although all these forms too have borrowed from other cultures in recent time.
So even the way that I'm dressed right here now is kind of a form of identity.
Yes, it is. And myself too.
And of course, you actually were born and raised in Africa.
Yes.
I was born and raised in the United States.
But how will people know that you are not a Nigerian or a Ghanaian unless you tell them?
That's right. and of course, I'm like the ugly American, as you know. Most Americans, you could always tell Americans, because there's an old saying that linguistically speaking, there's only two types of people in the world: those who are at least bilingual and Americans, And of course, if I go to Nigeria and open my mouth, they would know right away that I'm not Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa or any of the other ethnic groups. But let me just see if I can get some more expressions of culture. If you can just kind of give us, because we only have about 2-3 minutes to tell us.
Well, it's the totality of your way of life, what you eat, how you sleep, the clothes you wear, how you talk, how you relate to people.
So culture really is your way of life.
Yes, your philosophy, your religion. So it's a combination of everything you do as a human being, from the time you wake up to the time you sleep.
And your argument is that the more you're conscious of your culture and the more you're rooted in your cultural expressions, the more you can manifest power to those who would dominate you, and the more you can acquire for yourself an identity.
And you can also transmit it to another generation, so that over time, just as you respect yourself, others have to respect you.
How would that process of cultural transmission take place?
Socialization in the family, the struggles to insert your own identity into the school system, so that they teach those things that are black, Africans, African American.
So you said you use the word assert.
Yes.
Because you're saying it's not just telling people that you should do this, but you should be doing it yourself, and that's the transmission process. That's an interesting concept, because as you know, we have a lot of work to do in our educational system, and African Americans especially are on the bottom in terms of, in Ohio, for instance, the funding of schools is unconstitutional. Because they're saying it's just not an equitable funding source, and those who suffer disproportionately would be the African Americans. And if we as African Americans could assert our cultural selves into the school, our community, our religious institutions, you're saying that we could have a better possibility of transmitting a sense of pride and achievement in those schools. That probably is the area that we're lacking in terms of...
that's the power of culture.
That's interesting. That's very, very fascinating. One quick point before we let you go here. You're going to talk at Northern Kentucky University about the African diaspora and the power of culture.
Yes.
What other points, or could you just give us a just brief outline of the points that you're going to make?
Well, I will talk about the contributions of Africans to the United States in various aspects, and I will talk about the contributions of African Americans to Africa, which is tremendous. How Africans have seen African Americans as messiahs who can save them in their moments of trouble. And I will talk about how, irrespective of where blacks are, culture has been used to empower them and to organize resistance, protest, and formulate strategies for survival and emancipation.
So you're saying, in 30 seconds, you're saying that Africans in the United States, African Americans, have contributed to African culture?
Enormously.
And just a quick...
Well, they've contributed to the end of European rule in Africa. People like Du Bois.
Who died in Africa, didn't he?
Yes.
He proclaimed himself citizen.
Toure died in Gambia. Many, they've taken Christianity there, turned Christianity into a radical movement.
Oh, so because the Europeans had already taken Christianity there, you're saying when the Africans took it there, it was a different kind.
It was a different kind of Christianity they took there, the AME, and they've brought Africans here to go to school in black colleges, many of whom returned home to become leaders in their own country. Nkrumah of Ghana, Azikwe, these are people who came to school here and went to black colleges and became influential in Africa. So it's a dual traffic.
A fascinating topic.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Toyin Falola, can't wait to attend the lecture. And we're going to stay in touch. I'm going to read about at least 30 of those 40 books that you've read.
Thank you.
This has been a wonderful presentation, a wonderful interview. Thank you. Until next time, this is Michael Washington. Have a wonderful day.